So the thing that gets Homer Simpson elected is his really catchy line is, "Can't someone else do it?" That's his line that gets him elected. Is, this is the buffoonish idea that government should be capable of providing services.
Welcome to the More Freedom Foundation podcast, brought to you by political expert Robert Morris and Simpsons expert Ruairi McElhone.
Hello, Ruairi. How's it going?
It's going well. I've had a good week, and my manager let us off a day early, which is very nice of him.
Oh, that's very exciting.
How have you been getting on, Rob?
I'm very excited. Just this afternoon, the Economist year-end Christmas special arrived, which I'm very excited about. I've sort of fallen less and less in love with the Economist's coverage of everything as I've gotten older and gotten to learn a few things about the world myself. But I always enjoy that holiday issue. They've got some sort of long, deep dives.
Is that like your version of a comic annual at the end of a year?
Yeah, pretty much. Pretty much.
Interesting.
Yeah, it's fun. They go on a bunch of tangents, and it's enjoyable.
So I just want to let everyone know you have dived into a bit of early Christmasing by buying yourself a new Macintosh, and it is now incapable of working with your old microphone.
Indeed. I have. I've finally, after 43 years, I've made the jump to Apple and found that it does not work with the Blue Yeti microphone, which is...
They're quite like cats. They're very particular. You have to have everything that suits them. You can't just plug and play.
Actually, I had an absolute nightmare for a year trying to get Epson printer to work with my old PC. And that...
Oh, no.
That just
that's the other dark art of computers is the printer.
Well, so with the new Apple, it worked flawlessly, easily, didn't even need to install any new software.
Wow.
So then I was like, oh, well, I'll just, I've got 10 minutes before my meeting with Ruairi. I'll just plug in this Yeti and I'm sure everything will be fine. And turns out it wasn't fine. So apologies to the listeners if the sound quality is a bit down with this episode. I promise to try to have it figured out by next week.
But one nice thing, I think Apple tend to have good microphones and good speakers in their equipment, so at least that's a small mercy.
Oh, so I'll have the opportunity to give Steve Jobs' successors another couple $100. What a delight.
Yes, and the wonderful Tim Apple.
Yes, Tim Apple.
I always find that adorable.
The famous Tim Apple. So we've decided at Ruairi's insistence for the holidays to not be such a downer. So we're going to do, in our own special holiday episode, we're going to be talking about The Simpsons.
Specifically, one episode of The Simpsons, Season 9, Episode 22, Trash of the Titans. It's considered to be off the boil from the golden era, which seems to have ended at Season 8. But it's still a great episode.
Ruairi, before we just dive into the details and the minutiae that are very clear to sort of men of our age bracket, we should probably explain a little bit what The Simpsons is, why it is so significant, and just talk about it a little bit as the historical artifact that it is.
But the ongoing historical artifact.
Exactly. And that's it. What makes it so very odd. The Simpsons is, correct me if I'm wrong, I believe it is the longest running sitcom in American history. The longest run animated television show.
Animation?
Yeah, animated television show in American history.
So what's your first memory of The Simpsons?
I was 9 years old. I believe it was the first standalone broadcast of The Simpsons. It was a holiday special in 1988 or 1989. I think maybe it was 1989. Can't remember exactly. But it was funny because I and the neighbor kids were sort of thrown into a side room while my parents were having a party. And I think they just hadn't read about The Simpsons enough because they assumed it was like a children's cartoon. And it emphatically was not. It's kind of a cliche now, the cartoon for adults. And while The Simpsons was not like the first time anybody had tried that, I'm thinking of like Fritz the Cat, back in the 70s, but it was the first one to really mainstream the idea of this is a cartoon that isn't for children or isn't just for children necessarily. And The Simpsons made that cliche. And also, interestingly, like, did you know about this, Rory? It kind of made the Fox News network in a roundabout way.
Well, that's what I've heard, is that Fox was doing badly for a while, and a small family from Springfield saved them all.
Well, it's fascinating history, and it's just an indicator of how long this show has been around, how long it's been airing. This will be the 35th or 34th year, 2023.
It's nearly whatever so yeah, 10 years plus the whatever century we're in. So if it's 2022, then yeah, 32, 33 years. I think it might be 34 now. I don't know.
Well,
they seem to speed up faster than the years are going.
Time does,
which is a very rare thing in television.
Time does pass in strange ways. But one of the things that's most interesting about The Simpsons is it's from a completely different era of technology now. The way that the television was delivered in the United States, which I think is somewhat distinct from most of the world until the 1980s or so, is as competing commercial networks. It used to be that, if you had a television show, you had a television channel, you had a whole bunch of infrastructure that went with that television channel that you could use to broadcast. And each city had television channels, multiple television channels, and then a network of those channels, a national network, would be formed. And for decades, actually, I think largely the same companies that have been dominant in radio became dominant in television. So ABC, NBC, and CBS. It was these three networks. And for decades, from I think the early 1950s until the mid-1980s, people would keep trying to put a fourth network together, try to make a fourth nationwide commercial broadcasting network, and people kept failing miserably. And it seemed like Rupert Murdoch, this brash Australian billionaire who had been successful in newspapers in Australia, the United Kingdom, and the United States, it looked like he was about to be added to the list of failures. As his big splash with a lot of money, I think he spent billions on this back in the 1980s, back when that was more money than it is now. He purchased the wreckage of an old, failed fourth network, bought a bunch of stations, and for a couple of years, he just ate it. It just was not successful. He had a sketch comedy show, the Tracy Ullman Show, that wasn't too successful. He had Married with Children, which was a sitcom that was reasonably successful. He had a talk show with Joan Rivers that fell apart. It just was not working. And it was getting to the point in the mid-'80s where they're like, okay, maybe we should give up on this. So it's entirely possible that we'd have been in a situation where Rupert Murdoch just sort of ended up being a newspaper baron who was one more person to run into the fail in America. And then The Simpsons saved him. The Simpsons became an incredible phenomenon. I remember this. Rory, so I was born in 1979. Rory, I think you're significantly younger than I am, right?
1987.
87. So I remember in around the turn of the 1980s to the 1990s, The Simpsons were inescapable. In a way, they were culturally dominant in a way that it is impossible to be culturally dominant today. Back, in sort of the more straightforward culture where you really only had 4 or 5 television channels, you had your local newspapers, there was a degree of omnipresence that you could reach that The Simpsons really did reach. They were sort of on T-shirts everywhere. Bart Simpson was a cultural icon. It was a very, very big mass media deal. I don't know that The Simpsons have ever been as successful as they were in that first onslaught in the 1990s, and I think you're more attuned to this. I'm not actually much of a Simpsons fan. It's a terrible thing to admit.
That's why I wanted you to watch an episode, particularly this episode. From what I understand, you're an incredibly hard-working man. You've worked in a stock brokerage very early on, then lawyering in multiple countries, and then back to stock brokerage, and now professional political historical expert. And I just thought it'd be interesting to give you something a bit more common.
Well, I mean, Simpsons is it's iconic. It's so not only did it have that weird history to it, it's also, certainly for men of my generation, a sort of lingua franca, just sort of quoting well-known episodes, well-known lines of dialogue, well-known concepts. I had a coach in college who seemed to speak roughly half in Simpsons references. It was a
Seems quite common.
Yeah, it's a tremendously, and because I am by my nature something of a contrarian, despite the fact that I've often watched and enjoyed Simpsons episodes, I've never quite dived in to the extent that others have. So I guess I'm grateful for this opportunity, Ruairi.
I just want to ask, did you enjoy it at all, or did you find it an unpleasant experience?
Oh, I enjoyed it. It's just that, and I definitely have a lot to say about it, it's sort of fascinating artifact of April 26th, 1998 is when this episode was broadcast, apparently.
Did it feel dated at all?
I think it felt dated in some really obvious ways, but it's definitely still amusing. There's a certain, I guess my sense of humor is just darker than most. The moment of pure joy that I experienced watching this episode was probably the point at which there's a bear. Like, the episode begins with a very cynical creation of a Hallmark holiday by sort of a generic group of corporate people. And
there
the
aren't
icon...
enough holidays. There's a summer lull, and a man pitches the idea of just accepting our profits. We don't need any more. And the boss clicks his fingers, and two heavies drag him out of the office. And he says, I'm just going to make up something corny like Love Day, but come up with a better name. And they don't. And the Simpsons go hog wild for this new holiday.
Which creates a lot of waste, and brought it to the one moment that I actually enjoyed, or rather that I truly loved in this show, which is the love bear or something like that, which I think is sort of
I love you. And then Homer stands on his face.
Well, repeatedly. The key thing, Rory, is he does so repeatedly, as it's sort of a Teddy Ruxpin doll that just repeats this, I love you, and Homer repeatedly stomps it into the garbage can as it more and more plaintively proclaims, I love you. I laughed a lot at that.
That's the rule. He who tops it off, drops it off.
It isn't filled until it's spilled. I love you. I love you.
And then later on in the show, as I don't want to get too ahead of ourselves here, but as Springfield becomes engorged in garbage, there's a shot of the love bear or what have you in the seas of trash with I believe a syringe hanging out of him, and I laughed quite heartily at that, and I do think that it's interesting because I think I'll complain later on a bit about the cynicism of this episode, but I feel that I'm sort of the pot calling the kettle black, because my sense of humor, my sensibilities are usually the darkest. So I found sort of the darkest jokes in this episode to be the most personally satisfying. But
it starts off with a sort of anti-rampant consumerism, which then moves into an accidental environmental message, because he eventually falls out with the bin men, or refuge collectors, because he misses the bins and starts to call them, what is it, trash-eating stink bags?
Something along those lines, yes.
Yes. He falls out with the refuge collectors, and they refuse to take their bins out anymore. So they slowly turn into a landfill of their own, which has to be resolved.
It ends up with Homer Simpson being forced, or rather under false pretenses, his wife apologizes on his behalf to the sanitation engineer, Ray Patterson.
But you can't forge a signature for something like that. It's important. It's not like a loan or a will. This is important stuff. It's his honors at stake.
That's, I think, one of the other iconic lines from the episode. Homer delivering that response. So Homer's outraged. He goes to the sanitation engineer, who's portrayed, I believe, by Steve Martin.
Steve Martin, yeah.
An iconic U.S. comedian, or at least voice actor here. And I think the portrayal of Ray Patterson is kind of interesting because looking at this from the perspective of 25 years later, there's different narratives going on here. There's different sort of approaches here. Well, I think, so what happens is he falls out with the sanitation commissioner, who is portrayed as a really reasonable guy who just wants to get his work done.
He's very good at his job, a very boring pencil pusher, and he's been in the job, is it 26 years?
Something along those lines. I don't recall the exact number. And Homer decides that he's going to
rattle a few cages.
Yes, he's going to rattle a few cages, which he actually does very literally in Ray Patterson's office by harassing his poor set of parakeets or what have you. Decides to run against the sanitation commissioner. A wide variety of hijinks ensue, featuring U2 for some reason, the band.
This is a sort of beginning of a horrible trend. Feels very forced. I looked into this. Basically, U2 says, could we be in a Simpsons episode? And the Simpsons, of course, just were like, yes, and wrote U2 into this episode because this is the 200th episode of The Simpsons. So as Homer's doing campaigning, he's asked the locals, are you happy with your bins? And they say they love the bins. And he ends up insulting his own work colleagues, and they point out that they don't know who Ray Patterson is, but Homer is no Ray Patterson. So for some reason, Homer decides to invade a U2 concert to get some publicity. And this is where we get another cameo, which is, the Potato Man sketch.
The Potato Man sketch. I do not know the Potato Man sketch.
Homer, to get into the U2 gig, which are a famous Irish band, he pretends to be the Potato Man, who has to deliver potatoes.
Yes, I did notice that and think it was odd.
So there's a man called Paul McGuinness who was their manager at the time, so it's actually him letting them in. So for years I thought it was just random man, but no, it is their manager. So Homer finds his way onto the stage because U2 takes refuge collecting very seriously.
Mm-hmm.
But they would appear to be not popular, and the heavies give him some treatment.
That was kind of fun, just watching Homer Simpson get beat up on a Jumbotron.
Yes.
Over a late 90s iteration of U2. I think it's kind of funny because one of the things I recall about U2 is watching their Behind the Music special.
Okay.
On VH1, and it was kind of interesting that the dynamics of this television show, of the band on the show, are actually quite similar to the Behind the Music special, in that apparently the bass player was a big party guy, and the other guys weren't, and he was sort of unpopular with the band because of that. And in the Simpsons episode, he was also just sort of the butt of jokes or what have you. So I found that kind of interesting, and also just sort of a throwback to a very different era, 25 years ago, when we're talking about the way that you could be culturally omnipresent in the 20th century in ways that are kind of meaningless today, when everyone can just go on the internet and find their own thing.
Yeah.
U2 was a very, very big band. And it is kind of funny that back in 1998, though, they were certainly out of their mid-'80s heyday. It was still...
Yeah, they weren't young kids at the bleeding edge of fashion. They were sort of kind of like A-list rockers. You know, some bands just seem to live like Madonna. Like, she's not really doing hits, but she just lives at like top tier A-list level.
Well, I think you can judge it by, can they fill out stadiums? And I think U2 can.
Oh, that is something they can definitely do.
Yeah, they can still do it. But I think 25 years ago, there was still some youngster cultural cachet to them, a bit anyway. Or maybe Simpsons was making fun of them even at that point for pretending that they did.
There's one little thing we've went past. So when Homer wants to register to be in this election, he gets in the wrong queue, which is one for sex offenders.
Yes.
I'm pretty sure you won't have noticed this because he's quite obscure in The Simpsons itself. But behind him is a character called Freddie Quimby, which is Mayor Quimby's nephew. And the Quimbys are kind of like a caricature of the Kennedys.
Yes, I noticed that.
And this Freddie Quimby looks shockingly like Joe Kennedy III, who is currently the special envoy to Northern Ireland at the present.
Huh.
So I've managed to tie it into the modern day.
Joe Kennedy. So you know that guy, the Northern Ireland guy. He's sort of a famous loser, actually.
Is he a famous sex offender?
I don't. Well, I mean, he's a Kennedy. Sorry, no, that's a little unfair. So he decided a number of years back. I can't remember which cycle this was. Was this the 2020 or maybe 2018 cycle? He decided, well, I'm a Kennedy. I'm in politics. It's time for me to get a Senate seat. So he basically just decided that he would run against Ed Markey, the Massachusetts senator.
Because you're a Kennedy and that's what you can do.
That's what you can do. And he just sort of assumed it was his. And Ed Markey is a guy who's, I think he's super, super progressive, but he's got a pretty established record in Massachusetts and in the U.S. Senate. And it was just sort of like, no. So this guy, the most politically palatable current Kennedy, I think probably the only one of this generation that's trying. He's probably, 5-10 years younger than I am. So he's in his 30s or something. Just sort of assumed he'd be able to walk through the Democratic primary to the Massachusetts Senate seat, and was roundly defeated by Ed Markey, which is, I found somewhat satisfying. But yeah, it is kind of funny that Mayor Quimby is just this clear Kennedy reference, and it's sort of interesting that would be something that would make sense as a small town mayor. I don't quite understand how that works, other than I guess that the Kennedys were just a very well-known reference at that point.
I think they're also just great to caricature.
I mean, and also my understanding is that a lot of the Simpsons folks, the writers, were all Harvard kids, right? There's a bunch of
Okay, I didn't know
Conan
that.
O'Brien, and a lot of the initial nucleus of writers at the Simpsons. And if I know my Ivy League schools, once they've got a niche, they never let go of it. So presumably down to today, 30 odd years later, I assume there's a lot of Ivy League folks in that writer's room. But it kind of makes sense, Harvard, to be a bunch of snide, politically oriented Harvard kids and have some resentment of the Kennedys and some satisfaction, and sort of smacking them in as a corrupt, inept, small town mayor. I could see some satisfactions there.
I think it could also be that he seems to have a wide family, so maybe this is just one of the Kennedys that just became a small town mayor.
Entirely possible. Perhaps there's a President Quimby somewhere in the expanded
President
Simpsons.
Quimby, that's something to think about, isn't it?
In the expanded Simpsons universe.
So when we get to the debate, did this ring any bells at all?
Well, it seemed a lot like sort of like Billy Madison, but I'd say the obvious reference here would be like, oh, this is like Donald Trump on a debate stage with anybody.
Yes. Do you know about the Simpsons meme that they predict the future?
I've heard bits of this, yeah.
Well, yeah, there's the one where they predicted 9/11 and also COVID.
Oh, wow.
But I think it's just they generally reference stuff in the news and things repeat.
So there's what, 20 episodes a season or something like that?
Yeah, 23, something like that. And they've been going they're close to their 700th episode.
So I think at a certain point, when you're thinking about how to write the 340th, the 550th episodes, you're going to cover a lot of ground. And if you're of the mindset that finds significance in places where perhaps significance is not actually present, 700 episodes is going to provide a lot of fodder.
To give an example, based on The Simpsons, Homer becomes a kind of conspiracy theorist in one episode. I remember referencing this to you, and you were like, blank face. Homer becomes kind of like Alex Jones, but before Alex Jones, and he just comes up with random things. But one of his theories is that they're getting your fingerprints from pennies, and that's the only reason they're in circulation. So Homer is then kidnapped and put on an island, which is a reference to the British ITV show The Prisoner. But basically when he tries to leave, like a big giant bubble will envelop him. And he also then will say, they're all assigned numbers. They don't have names anymore. And Homer's like, I am a man. I don't have a number. And then he goes, oh, wait, I'm 4. That is similar to what's happening with The Simpsons. If you just say enough stuff, some things will overlap with reality.
I think that's true.
But here we have, it reminds me more of Trump when he was in the, trying to be a candidate for the Republican Party?
Primaries. Yeah, that was sort of an extraordinary performance, really. The 2015, Trump at the 2015 Republican primaries, and just the absolute demolition of his rivals that he carried out. I think he certainly did okay in debates with Hillary Clinton, but it wasn't on the level of the just absolute demolition that he handed out.
Oh, yeah, he just went all out. But it did remind me of Homer in the sense that he didn't have anything to lose, and he was such an outsider, he could just come up with outlandish claims.
Well, I think what's interesting about the comparison here is that, I wrote in my notes here, it's like Hillary Clinton was no Ray Patterson.
No.
Because
Ray Patterson was a very hardworking, efficient government employee.
Yeah, the sanitation engineer Homer Simpson was running against was
sanitation commissioner.
Pardon me, commissioner. Is at least portrayed on the show as a model of competence and quiet public service. That is not something that I associate with Hillary Clinton, let alone
absolutely not.
The 2015.
I just remember
2015 era Republican
it's something
Party.
That's so cringe that I adore it. Pokemon go to the polls. Can I just point out something that I always respected Donald Trump for this in that debate? Do you remember at the end where they have the sort of, to try to calm them down, they'll say, is there something you respect in the opposition candidate? Trump gave a genuine answer, and Hillary Clinton basically said, oh, his children are nice, which is a sort of sneery, backhanded way of saying, I don't find anything nice about you.
Well, but I think it is worth emphasizing, and let me emphasize first that Donald Trump is a uniquely loathsome figure, had less to offer than Homer Simpson did in terms of solutions. I mean, it's funny. So when Homer Simpson does eventually get around to his disastrous tenure as the sanitation commissioner, he's at least doing things. He's at least trying things and sorting things out.
I think that Homer is more innocent. He's not corrupt. He's just stupid.
Well, he's stupid, but he actually was able to do more to change the institution than Donald Trump did in 4 years. But before we get there,
yes.
I think it's worth pointing out, because I think this Trump comparison is common here, is that Trump did not come up because, the herd is silly and stupid. Trump came up because the herd was abused by decades of corruption and rank abject failure. What's kind of extraordinary is that people will still describe Hillary Clinton as an impressive political figure, which is not what she was. Her most high-profile job was as the Secretary of State, and her two biggest legacies were the destruction of Libya, which we've lamented on this podcast, and she was out of office by the time the sort of revolution of dignity actually kicked off in Ukraine. But she certainly laid a lot of the groundwork for the Ukraine catastrophe that we're dealing with right now. So yeah, her legacy is sort of the Arab Spring and the war in Ukraine.
Yeah, I'm always reminded of something that was incredibly embarrassing. Do you remember they were going to reset Russian relations?
Yeah.
And to do this, they brought out like a big, an emergency button you'd have on a machine.
Mm-hmm.
And they push it together and you're like, this is just sort of horrific. This photo op is worse than anything the Russians had done up to that stage. And horrific, tacky nonsense.
And I think what's important to emphasize, this is the Christmas episode, Ruairi. We don't want to get too deep into actual meat here, is that this is a criticism of Obama and a criticism of Bush, which is, I think, also rests on just as flimsy foundations as the idea that Hillary Clinton was some kind of worthwhile political figure. And this idea that, Bush looked into Putin's eyes and saw his soul and, was really embarrassed, by saying that, or the fact that he said that was an embarrassment, and he was really nice to Putin, and then Obama was really nice to Putin, and that's simply not true. I agree entirely that we should mock Hillary Clinton for pushing the reset button, but I think it's also important to remember, and is often forgotten, that neither the Bush or Obama administrations at any point pressed the reset button with Russia. There was at no point any kind of opening or positive reset in relations with Russia. It was nonstop NATO expansion throughout the Bush and Obama years. The 2012 elections, while I'm sure Putin exaggerates the extent to which the United States tried to manipulate those elections, there is no question that there was actual U.S. manipulation there. So I think that it's absolutely right to mock things like Bush's claim to see inside Putin's friendly soul or Hillary Clinton pushing the reset button. It's also important to remember that those were just the public relations efforts, and there actually was no solid attempt to build any bridges with Russia at any point, but from the U.S. government. I think Europeans tried very hard. Unfortunately, they had to deal with U.S., the actions of the U.S. hegemon that sort of made European attempts to build bridges kind of worthless. But anyway, we're talking about The Simpsons here. Sorry.
The Simpsons doesn't do politics.
Well, The Simpsons always does politics. And I mean, I don't know if you want to keep running through the synopsis, and I'll talk, because the politics of this arc of this whole episode are kind of fascinating, sort of 25 years later.
Homer, basically, he does everything he promises, essentially, but he does it by spending. He spends a year's budget in a month. And Homer has a great idea of not paying the bin men, but that is not going to work, according to Quimby. So Homer comes up with a great idea. Do you know what it is?
Well, he decides he's going to import the garbage from all of the towns around and start filling
shove it in an old mine,
an abandoned mine under the city of Springfield with the refuse from all around.
And did you see your current town? New York?
Well, they were shipping garbage from New York? I didn't catch that.
Yes, all the bin lorries, originally the ones say Springfield, they just say that.
Mm-hmm.
And then when he starts to fill up the old mine, you'll see Chicago, and then you'll see one with New York, and the one with New York is full of hand grenades, guns, and heroin needles.
Yes, 1998. In 1998, New York had already been significantly cleared up by Mayor Dinkins. And then, of course, a lot of his glory was stolen by Rudy Giuliani, because a lot of the white people in the suburbs didn't want to give any credit to an African-American mayor. But anyway, by 1998, New York was a much safer place, but it still had that reputation well earned in the 80s as a haven of drugs and crime. So yeah, I did notice. I think that might have been the point where the love bear showed up with the syringe in his eye, which
Yes, the love bear comes back, but is full of needles, unfortunately.
yeah, I found that quite amusing. I did not catch, however, that the hand grenades and syringes were all from New York, which is kind of amusing. So it all devolves into catastrophe. So is that, I thought I'd heard that song before. Before it all devolves into catastrophe, you know, Homer has...
Yes, there is a musical number.
Yeah, the garbage man can, or is that how that...
It might be based on an old song, but I'm unaware of what it is from.
Gosh, I feel that I'm falling down. I come from a very theatrical family, and I'm sure that if my brother were ever to listen to this, he'll be shouting at me for not knowing exactly what
I've ruined your Christmas. I'm sorry.
Yeah, I like it. I think, is it the Music Man? I don't know. It does ring a bell.
Yeah,
but you know,
the Garbage Man.
The Garbage Man can. Yeah, I think it's probably the Music Man.
Who can take your trash out? Stomp it down for you. Shake the plastic bag and do the twisty thingy too. The Garbage Man.
Oh, the Garbage Man can.
Amusing.
One thing I find strange about that is I think the worst singing in that is Bono, who is a professional singer.
Yeah, it doesn't come across very well, but it's very amusing, and there's a big musical number, and there's special uniforms, and you sort of get a sense of that sort of surrealism that The Simpsons has became so beloved for. Even though my understanding is that this is...
Well, it's able to feel grounded and then do something ridiculous, like have a musical number with Bin Men.
Yeah. So it's quite amusing. It is amazing just how much they managed to pack into, 22 minutes? Or something along those lines?
Yeah, it is incredible.
And so then it turns out that the mine becomes over full, and the city just starts overflowing with explosions of trash.
It starts to erupt at a golf course when Homer is with Mayor Quimby. It erupts, and then it erupts a bit more, and then it pops out of one of the holes, and Mayor Quimby goes, "Why am I seeing a textbook paper from Texas?" And Homer runs away.
You know, I didn't get that. I that might be, is that's some...
No, I think it's just, this isn't Texas. Why is there an exam paper from Texas?
Oh, because it's from Texas. I thought there might be some like late 90s news hook for its...
Well, there can be there's just a lot. It is very dense. Like,
okay.
I only noticed, I watched it 3 times, and the second time when Homer's doing the song, he's talking about them taking your tissue papers. And it's just a man with a giant nose saying, "Oh, that'd be great." And it's just a silly throwaway gag, but I've missed it multiple times. This is just very, very dense on jokes, and also multi-tiered. Like, you are getting highfalutin jokes and jokes about people with big noses. The town is not happy with this at all. So what do they try to do?
They try to put Steve Martin back in charge. They try to bring back Ray Patterson. And then Ray Patterson comes up onto the stage after he's been reseated as the sanitation commissioner by acclamation, and he says,
Oh gosh. You know, I'm not much on speeches, but it's so gratifying to leave you wallowing in the mess you've made. You're screwed. Thank you. Bye.
and he says, "I'm not interested." He basically says, "You guys have made your bed, now lie in it," and he storms off.
Do you know what the music is a reference to?
I don't.
Apparently, so there was a show in the UK called A Steptoe and Son, and when it finished its run, an American version came out, which was called Sanford.
Sanford and Son was based on a UK model?
Sanford and Sons.
I'm very surprised.
So when he was doing a comedy gig, Red Fox came out to the music, and he seen that there was like 3 people in the audience, and he thought, well, I can't be bothered with this, so he walked straight off stage and the band was confused, so they just played the music again.
My God, I did not. So I am aware of Sanford and Son. This is talking about the way television used to work. Is old television shows used to run on in syndication, and this is what networks would show when they weren't showing new programming. Or rather, the local affiliates could be completely different.
So just repeats, essentially.
Yeah, so I remember watching Sanford and Son as a kid, even though it ended in 1977, and I am shocked to hear that it was based on a British sitcom, because I think the Sanford and Son...
And it's a sitcom that's so old, the early seasons are in black and white.
Wow.
It is actually a very good show, and the one bit of knowledge everyone likes to say is the old man outlived the young man in it. Also, the old man in it is in, the Beatles movie?
Yes, I do.
A Hard Day's Night.
I actually watched that recently. Pretty good.
He's in it.
Yeah.
If you noticed an old man with very few teeth, that's him.
Well, it's funny, because so in Sanford and Son, I think it was one of the bigger shows featuring African Americans in the 1970s. And I guess Steptoe and Son, it's just they're white folks, but they're just sort of...
Yeah, they're just white people.
Disadvantaged, or...
Yes, they do live in a skip. They are very poor.
So anyway, Steve Martin isn't having it. He's over it, and they decide to resolve this issue of the complete destruction of Springfield in a open and exploding landfill. They resolved this issue by putting the entire town on trailers and moving it 5 miles down the road, which I thought was very, very cute.
What I thought was interesting is it reminds me of something Trump's grandfather did.
Really?
Yes, so Trump's grandfather was a quite the character. I think quite a horrible man, but I think it was during one of the gold rushes. He had like a big hotel, but it wasn't in the best location. So he raised it up on stilts and moved it onto a barge, and then just took the barge to the new town that was developing in the gold rush. He didn't ask for permission for the land or anything. He just got people to scooch the hotel off, and then kind of the most handy place, they just left it there. And he moved his hotel and did quite well for himself, apparently. So we have
never heard of that.
A double Trump reference.
Wow, I'd never heard of that.
No.
So that's how the episode ends. Springfield has just moved 5 miles down the road, and Homer is set free to go about his chaotic
They're still
ways.
littering. There is a big environmental message in this. They said it was coincidental. So it ends with the crying Indian. Is that the name of that advert?
Yes. So it's a famous advertisement from, I believe, the 1970s. Yeah, where there's a Native American who sees a piece of litter and sheds a single tear.
Did you hear the theories about it being like part of like a bigger campaign to essentially pollute more?
I have not heard those theories.
Well, it's about the idea of, rather than the company making products that are easy to recycle or rot away, it's putting the emphasis on the individual. It's your fault. You bought this product, so it's saying you deal with this. You don't make the Native Americans cry, instead of, us giant corporations that have more ability to do that.
The whole concept of a personal carbon footprint when we've got Exxon and British Petroleum still running around the world.
Yes, that have top engineers and massive budgets that could do more than you or I could.
Yeah, just as have you heard about? So apparently, I read about this. This was a big to do 3 to 6 months back. Apparently, most plastic recycling is just BS. It just doesn't actually happen.
Yes. Well, I don't want to put anyone off. Metal and glass can be recycled. Glass can be recycled infinitely, and metal is so difficult to mine that recycling it is very easy. So those are two you should always do. But yes, plastic. I've heard things that, like, for bottles, if you have like one lid in amongst the plastic of the body of the bottle, about a ton's worth of that, just one lid can kind of spoil it. So yes, plastic recycling is incredibly difficult and expensive.
So essentially all of the sorting we do, is just largely a public relations effort. to allow oil companies to drill as much as they want.
It depends, as I say, but yes, because plastic is incredibly cheap and it's a byproduct of the oil industry.
So we've run through the episode. I just found this very interesting, just sort of like the differing approaches to things. So nominally it's about mocking Homer Simpson for his deep-seated cynicism and his sort of populism, his utterly brainless populism. But what's interesting is that there are so many aspects of this show that sort of document very similar instincts, or instincts that have ended up trending in very similar ways, that sort of ended up with Trump. Just the whole framing device for the show, or at least the opening vignette, where we see the corporation that invents Loveday, and it's such a, I guess it's a very 1990s thing. That sort of level of cynicism. Honestly, it's more of a early 1990s thing.
Well, we also have the boss is a fat white man with a cigar.
Yes. It's classic model there. I think even in the late 90s, you didn't have many cigar chomping CEOs anymore. But it's definitely, I mean, it's a sea of sort of archetypes and ways of viewing things that maybe we shouldn't read into so much. But it's also just that sort of resigned cynicism. It's funny, have you heard that it's actually Generation X is apparently the largest generational supporter of Donald Trump?
They seem to be a generation that's annoyed that they're not young anymore the most.
Well, that's
one theory with Generation X.
That's certainly true. But the thing that Generation X was always most renowned for, and I think a passion for The Simpsons, is probably kind of a Generation X thing.
Well, I would say more millennial.
Well, I don't know, though.
But this is possibly where I'm going into, it's part of like American culture abroad. Generally about 10 years after, so, the fancy channels would get the new Simpsons, but essentially golden era Simpsons that we were unaware of would get played on free television constantly. So it might have been 10 years out of date, but we just loved it. And then when I heard about places like Australia had a channel that would air it for 6 hours, and they went mad for it. So if you consider you have this cultural bycatch that's constantly kind of letting the world know about America, but I would say ultimately in a positive manner. I know in this it is very cynical, but the corruption is it's still with in a way.
Yeah, that's fascinating. I hadn't really thought about it like that. I remember when I moved to Turkey, I would get on fairly well with folks who were 5-10 years younger than I was, because we grew up on sort of the same cultural products, because there used to be that delay. But I would say in the United States, The Simpsons would, as a cultural product, would definitely skew very Generation X. You're talking about something.
Well, I remember listening to the last podcast on the left. They did a tour of Europe recently, and they were saying that The Simpsons in the UK, to them, felt like it was in America in the 90s. People are still mad for it, while to them it's sort of just another show.
Interesting. Well, because presumably with streaming, The Simpsons are more available than they've ever been.
Definitely, but one little gripe I have is the aspect ratio is wrong.
Oh, really? Oh, I remember reading something about that.
When you watch it on Disney Plus, because they don't want to have the bars at the side, which is 4:3, they zoom it in, so it's like the widescreen, but it means it's too close, and then the framing's a bit off, but that's me being pedantic.
I was thinking while I was watching it that it did look crappier than I remember, honestly, and I could see if you'd zoomed in a little further, that would be. But also it is animation from the 90s.
Because I think this animation looks a lot better than the modern animation. Just gives me the creeps. There's just something very tragic and machine about it. I think it's obviously going. Mm-hmm. In the 90s, it would have been hand drawn on the cellulose, is it? And they flip it back and forth. But now it will be all computer. But did you know that this episode had an influence on Toronto City Council?
I did not.
Because they were planning to do what Homer did and fill a load of rubbish in a mine. So campaigners that didn't want this to happen, literally played this episode, and it pretty much summed up the whole shebang.
Oh, fascinating.
So there's at least one bit of anti-landfilling that may have happened thanks to this episode.
But I just want to, on that Generation X angle, it is the generation that cynicism was their thing. So I'm on the cusp. I'm sort of a Xennial, I guess. I was born in 1979. I was actually interested. It was interesting to look into this. Apparently, the guy who wrote this episode, Ian Maxone Graham, was born in 1959. So that makes him a pretty solid baby boomer. And it's a little strange to reflect that 25 years ago, baby boomers who were younger than I am were writing The Simpsons. Were in the full flush and prime of their cultural career. But as a cultural product, I think it is The Simpsons' sort of cynical view on things ended up shaping a lot of like Generation X worldview. And it's just kind of fascinating that, because the true heyday of The Simpsons, this is at like the tail end, would have been broadcast in the United States in 1990 through like 1995 or so.
Well, yeah, the golden era is considered season 3 to season 8.
Yeah.
Yeah, so 97 would be the end of the golden era.
So when I look at something like this, and I'm like, yeah, I'm sort of laughing along with a lot of these things, but I do sort of see a lot of the attitudes, not just that, oh, haha, look, Homer Simpson looks like Trump. I see a lot of the sort of attitudes and the cynicism that sort of helped to lead to Trump. Because on the one hand, it's sort of critiquing this idea that sort of, oh, everything's screwed, who cares? But then on the other hand, it's sort of like, well, this is Hallmark holidays, that's sort of the term. And it just, I don't know, there's something about that sort of cynicism. Maybe I'm sort of imagining things here. But what I thought was...
So to reference another Simpsons meme, Simpsons did it. It usually refers to them, quite a lot of jokes they have done before other people have, but here they have created Trump, according to you.
I would not say they created Trump, but it is interesting.
Simpsons did it.
I think a lot about the just sort of the level of cynicism that we have, or just YouTube comments I get where there's a particular news story that I found particularly horrifying that I won't even mention now. I'm not even going to mention it until the new year, but I think we're going to do a whole episode on it. But I did a short on it on the YouTube channel, and someone was like, what do you expect? This is just what the United States does, And it's just that level of like, there's nothing we can do, nothing can be better, nothing can change for the better. And I think that attitude kind of suffused not just Homer Simpson's approach to politics in this episode, but also this episode's approach to politics. It's just sort of like, well, the world is just messed up. There's nothing we can do about it.
Unwell.
Exactly. What I found really fascinating is that there's sort of a libertarian through line to this episode. So the thing that gets Homer Simpson elected is his really catchy line is, "Can't someone else do it?" That's his line that gets him elected. This is the buffoonish idea that government should be capable of providing services. That's the silly, ridiculous thing.
You have to work hard and come up with a slogan that will appeal to the lazy slobs out there, is what Moe tells him.
Yep.
And Homer says, "Can't someone else do it?" And yes, that is the birth of his catchy slogan.
Indeed, and like in the world of the show, the idea is that the garbage man is going to come in and sort your trash for you.
Yeah, they tidy up your house.
Carry the garbage out in the morning or this, that, the other thing. But the sort of instinct, the world that is constructed here is just like the idea that a government would provide services is sort of a silly idea for lazy slobs. And I think that's pretty politically significant. And I think that were I to watch this in 1998, who knows, maybe I did. I don't remember much of 1998. But I found that very significant that was like buffoonish Homer Simpson is laughable and sad and the stupid option because he believes that government should provide services. And I thought that was sort of an interesting takeaway. And you sort of tie these trends together.
Well, there's an argument often given that, oh, you can't do this for the public, you can't give them good health care, you can't give them good services because you have to balance the budget. But countries aren't like houses. They can spend 100 years paying off a war, which is something a household just can't do. So I can see some conservative or even libertarian arguments there.
Yeah, I think it's just sort of interesting, thinking about The Simpsons as just this omnipresent cultural artifact, and just sort of nobody really ever mentions that it came from, or at least was run by, a lot of the same executives that brought us Fox News. And it is kind of interesting looking at this, grand, iconic old episode and just sort of looking at that subtext there. And I get to wonder, it's like...
If Fox had have died without The Simpsons, we wouldn't really have Fox News as we know it today.
Oh, that wouldn't have... Certainly the details would be different, but that wouldn't have changed like the trajectory of sort of global Reaganism or anything. But I do think it is interesting to consider that The Simpsons came from the same office building as Fox News. And it's just sort of interesting that Fox generally, the Fox network, was billed as something that was so transgressive. And that's why the fourth network that was Fox, this is before Fox News, which was a cable product, I guess, starting in the 90s. The reason that it succeeded was because it billed itself as so transgressive and out there. And I mean, from the context of the 1980s, early 1990s, it really was. Shows like In Living Color, Fox was the channel that would sort of go there. But it's kind of interesting reflecting, especially on the most beloved of the Fox products, on Simpsons. It's just like that these things were so transgressive, but their politics were actually the very epitome of elite. I mean, it's a bunch of Harvard guys cracking libertarian jokes that became culturally omnipresent and sort of the lingua franca.
So it reminds me of Monty Python in that sense, because they were all highly educated at Oxford and Cambridge, which was kind of how comedy was done back in those days, only that the super elites could do it, which kind of a lot of their sketches are very intellectual based. But I think it may be time to wish everyone a happy Christmas.
Oh yeah, we're getting to the end there.
Yes.
Yeah. All right. Well, no, but I thought it was fascinating to just sort of look at that, and I think I'm probably overinterpreting. It's just like what.
Well, no, it's good too, because I think all interpretations can be correct.
But I mean, also it's just what the sea of culture that everybody at The Simpsons was swimming in 1998. But it is kind of interesting that just sort of fundamentally libertarian message that that Homer Simpson's populism helps to highlight on The Simpsons. It's kind of interesting. All right, folks, I think this is probably going to be the last or the second to last episode this year. Thanks so much for tuning in to this new podcast. I think in the 2023, we're going to start out a little light on produced videos on YouTube, but the podcast will keep coming, and the shorts will probably still keep coming. And I just wanted to thank you all for listening and for being around as the media empire grows. Thanks so much, and thanks to Ruairi for suggesting this podcast in the first place. It's been a lot of fun.
Music from Kevin MacLeod.
Happy holidays!
But do we want to